And that's sort of where I wanted to start with you. Is motivation.
Yeah.
Because that's pretty much what drives everybody. And I think you're probably the best person to talk about that because you are an academic, psychotherapist. You've studied family business or taught family business?
Both.
Okay.
And researched. In particular, researched. Family business.
Entrepreneurship as well.
Yes.
You've published over 150 journal articles.
Yes.
And you have supervised 30 PhD students.
Yeah.
So you have talked to a lot of people in a lot of different scenarios.
Yep.
And you also understand people and what motivates them. So what would motivate people more? The past experiences or the thought of future experiences? What would drive people into the future and get them to take action more?
Well, it's probably a bit of both, as well as what's happening currently in their lives. Okay. And I think if we focus on the current aspects, you're looking to see where people are at. What is it that's driving them to act or not act? And I think it's also helpful to look at what might be the barriers to action. So what's resisting them to act, to behave, and maybe even to feel? Okay, so you're really looking at a whole range of aspects. So if we're focusing on the past, what have been what we're talking about are their experiences. How have they experienced, action? How have they experienced events? And what has motivated them to do something? Okay, to behave in a different way, or behave in a better way, or to behave in whatever way, okay, based on, what they're observing at the moment or what their goals might be, okay? And when it comes to the future, the future aspects, we're really talking about many things, and one of which are the consequences. If I act or behave this way, what might be the consequences? Can I see, for example, long-term benefits? Will there be a long-term benefit? And these long-term benefits are usually incremental. Okay? So I'm behaving or I'm going to do something because I know and I have this belief. So we're talking about lots of different things. I have this belief that I will improve. And if that makes...
If I was to coach you for the next 30 days on your habits, your nutrition, your sleep, your fitness, do you think you'd feel like a new person? I see this all the time. People getting excited after watching a YouTube video, listening to a podcast or downloading a PDF. They have all this good information, but then they fail. A, because they don't know how to implement that information, or B, they haven't got anybody holding them accountable to implement that information in their day-to-day life. And that is exactly why I created the 30-day reset. So we can work together every single day for the next 30 days. I'm going to show you how to build a rock-solid morning routine. Make a workout routine that fits into your life, that works for you instead of against you. How to eat for your goals without tracking calories. We're going to work on the fun stuff, stress management, sleep, and then we're going to build a strong mindset so these habits last well after the 30 days is done. I am obviously excited to help you in this next 30 days. So let's get started. Stop watching the YouTube videos, podcasts, all that sort of stuff, and let's just start making real change that lasts for the next 30 days and beyond. Okay, stop waiting. Let's get into it. Let's go.
Sense.
It does.
Yeah.
So when it comes to those beliefs or the barriers,
yeah,
are they emotions? To give an example, we were just talking about surfing. So surfing for a lot of people is, I guess, very scary because it's the ocean. Most people don't know how to swim. So do we need to overcome that emotion of fear so they can learn how to swim? Or like, where do we look at sort of getting somebody to then take action and move forwards?
Well, the barriers are multi-determined. And like most events, I view things from this multi-perspective. The barriers could actually be genetic. Okay. For example, there are people who have a particular gene or set of genes or cluster of genes. And these genes might enable these people to feel less fearful. You can take drugs of one sort or another that help to reduce fear or to reduce the barriers to going out into the surf, for example. But for most people, and I think this is the other aspect, are your cognitions. So how do you think about going out to surf? One individual might think, far out, that is going to be the scariest thing in the world. I'd rather swim in a pool. I could drown. So you're thinking about the negative consequences. Whereas another person might think, wow, this is a challenge. I really want to develop myself. I'd love to be able to surf like some of the best surfers in the world. Or I'd like to surf like my mate. Okay? And that can be a driver, a motivator. Okay? So it's the ways in which you view your world can act as a motivator. And also the way that you think about it. So the thinking, the viewing, and that's tied in with the point that you're making, the emotions. Okay? So in other words, how do those thoughts make you feel? Okay? So one way of viewing the world, it is your thoughts that determine how you feel about a situation. And this is where we start to get into the so-called cognitive behavioral aspects. Cognitions create affect or emotions and determine your behavior. And that is, do I go out into the surf, or do I just sit on or walk on the beach, on the foreshore, and just enjoy that? And that's just as good. Okay? And and so I think it can be beneficial to view the world from this multi-determined perspective. And we can say the same thing about problems that people present with. Sometimes there are unitary or single determinants, triggers. But those triggers might be determined by past experiences. Okay? Experiences from within the family, from within school, or socially, or even just walking down the street. You're walking down the street and someone, calls you something that's, quite negative. Okay? And so therefore, you might start to have experiences each time you walk along that same street, for example, because you've had that past experience. Okay, so there's those thoughts that if I go along there, I might meet that person, or there might be a dog, and I'm sure we've all had that. Like when I was at primary school, there was this little dog that bit me on the bum once, and I used to hate it. I wanted to go and see my friend, but I would always look out to see, is that dog there? Because, how am I going to avoid it, for instance, and so on.
Okay, so how did you get into psychology or psychotherapy?
Well, yeah, it's a good question. And I've always worked, or not always, I always wanted to work with young people, children, adolescents, okay? And so my first job was working with children with disabilities. And I worked and while I was still at university, I actually applied for a job to work in this particular institution. It was called Uralla. And in those days, it was called Uralla Hospital School for Crippled Children. They wouldn't use that title now, but it was a fabulous place. And I was working with young people who had, hemiplegia, spastic, they had spasticity, high levels of spasticity, muscular dystrophy. And it was such a rewarding place to work with these people. And but after a couple of years, I started to become very interested in the psychological aspect. And an opportunity arose for me to work at one of the first community, it was the first community mental health centres in Australia.
Yeah, right.
And it was was really set up by the former Whitlam government. And it would probably give you an idea of my age, because I'm in my 70s. And boy, this was a place that, or a setting that really opened my eyes, because as a young person, you want to develop, you want to grow. And psychology was an opportunity for me to do that. And so you'd be working with psychologists, you'd be working with occupational therapists. And at that time, I was an occupational therapist working in a community mental health centre at the front line. So you'd go out and visit people in their own homes. People would walk in from off the street, but it was very, very anxiety-provoking, because you don't have that same depth of experience as a psychiatrist might have, okay, where they've had years and years of training, they're a member of a college and so on. And so it was a learning opportunity. And from there, I did a course in psychology at La Trobe, at Melbourne University. And so my career started from there. And plus, at that time, it was 1977. And there was the first program in Victoria concentrating on child and adolescent psychotherapy. And there was just a small group of people who participated in that program at the Austin Hospital. It was just brilliant, where you learnt about psychodynamic psychotherapy and how to work with young people in particular. Okay.
Can you just explain the difference between therapy, psychotherapy, psychologist? Why would somebody go see a psychologist or a psychotherapist?
Well, a psychologist can be a psychotherapist, and a psychotherapist can be a non-psychologist or even a non-psychiatrist, because you've got psychiatry, which is a medically trained person. Psychologists, on the other hand, are non-medically trained. Okay, but that doesn't prevent a medically trained person from doing a degree in psychology, or a higher degree in psychology. But you've got other professionals who can be psychotherapists, such as social workers, or a lay person can get training in psychotherapy. Okay?
Yep.
So there are, again, this multi-determined aspect. There are multiple roads to becoming a psychotherapist, for example. And I think people also need to bear in mind that there are many, many different forms of psychotherapy, just as there are many, many different forms of psychology or psychological approaches to dealing with problems, challenges that people present with. And there are many different theoretical approaches that people might adopt. Currently, we have the cognitive behavioural approach, okay? But we have psychodynamic approaches. For example, these approaches have emanated from the Freudian school, okay? But there are other, which is the psychoanalytic aspects, and people may have heard of Sigmund Freud, and he is considered to be, for example, the father of modern day psychiatry, modern day psychotherapy. But there are different forms of psychoanalytic therapy. You have the South American schools, you have the US, you have the French, such as the Lacanian school of psychoanalysis. You've also got the Northern European school, the Carl Jung aspects. And so psychotherapists or psychologists might adopt these different theoretical approaches. They may specialise in one, or they might utilise several theoretical frameworks when it comes to working with people. Okay?
So there's a lot of different avenues people can go down, but what's the end goal for all these types of therapy?
The end goal might be assisting a person to deal with a particular symptom, a particular problem. Another end goal might be to assist a person to change their behaviour. Another goal might be to assist an individual to gain a greater insight into themselves. Okay? Or another goal might be to assist someone to deal with a particular target complaint. That complaint might be, can you help me deal with my unhappiness? Can you help me to deal with my anger, as in anger management? Okay? If it's a child, for example, the child may have a problem with bedwetting. And it could be very distressing, not only for the child, but also for the family. Okay? So there are many end goals, and I guess people go into therapy for a multitude of reasons.
To try and, the way I sort of taken from that is, at the end, we're just trying to understand ourselves, understand the world we're in, and how to manage it. Would that be a fair...
that is one way, but some people don't want understanding.
Why not?
Because they're just interested in dealing with a particular problem or a particular issue. I don't need understanding. And there are some approaches to therapy, be it psychotherapy or psychiatry, to just deal with that issue that they're coming in for. Okay? Not everyone wants understanding. I want to be able to deal with my sleep problem. How can you assist me to deal with that sleep problem? And, we did touch upon this before, this podcast, and you have your ways of assisting people to do that. I have a particular approach. My wife, who's a clinical psychologist, she has hers. And when I was, assisting someone with that particular issue, and all we're focusing on, for example, was the sleeping problem. He said, Kosmas, I have this problem sleeping, because of a particular event. I gave him my advice, but my wife and I checked out with her, and I said, what did you think of the advice that I gave this person? And she said, I would also add closing the book, because part of this advice was, don't lie in bed awake, ruminating, no different to a cow. Just have a pencil, a paper, and just write down what's troubling you, and say to yourself, I'll deal with that problem tomorrow, or, in the morning, at a later point. But my wife said, what I also say to clients that I see is I suggest that they close the pad, the notepad, the book, the exercise book, shut. So you're putting closure to it. Okay? But there are other aspects to this technique. And I thought, shit, that's a bloody good idea.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay? But someone else would give other advice. And I had a fabulous supervisor. And he was a cognitive behavioural therapist. This is back in the 80s. And my PhD supervisor, Rob Kirkby, his name is, psychologist, a behavioural, more than a behavioural, is really into health psychology. And he used to work with elite sports people, your swimmers, top ballerinas, people that used to be on quiz shows on TV as a way of assisting them deal with their anxiety. And one technique that he taught me, kind of, just in passing, was to use the word stop. So getting back to this sleep problem, and this is something that I recommended to this person, was while they're in bed, to say the word stop. Stop the ruminating. Stop the propaganda. Stop the bullshit, the BS. Because that's what it is. Because when we're half awake, we tend to magnify problems. Make them out to be so much bigger than what they are. And so it's really important to stop it. And we could even have this problem during the day. And here's to recommend, just put an elastic band on your wrist and just give yourself a flick and say the word stop. And this is a behavioural technique. Not necessarily cognitive behavioural, but a behavioural technique. And that's another theoretical approach. We're using carrots and sticks, rewards and punishments and so on. Okay? So I know we're going around in circles a bit, and apologies for that. But I guess the more you understand about the theoretical aspects, I guess the more informed you are. And as a psychotherapist or psychologist or psychiatrist, you really want to have this array of approaches, array of techniques, and a mixture of them that you can actually assist the clients that you're working with. Okay? Yeah, I feel as though I'm rambling on a bit.
Definitely not. So there's again, all the different techniques,
Yeah.
understanding them all.
Yeah.
And as we spoke about before we sat down and recorded, all the information's good, but trying to get people to take action. Like your friend who wanted some advice on sleep.
Yes.
I think most of the population should be sleeping a lot better and putting a lot more effort into sleep, because
I agree.
it's very important, and it governs a lot of different things. But trying to get people to the point where they ask for help on sleep, I find that's the hardest part. Like, we got all this information and amazing ways to help people,
Yeah.
but trying to get people to that point. So how would you go about getting people to spot when they're not doing things right? So a couple of weeks ago, I had a coach on who helps people with eating disorders. So she went through some pretty horrific childhood, so sexual abuse, rape, all that sort of stuff, which led to abusing food in both eating too much and not enough, and caused all sorts of issues.
Yes.
But she said at one point, like, she didn't even realise that she wasn't eating enough, and she'd lost 80 kilos. Like, she was just a stick of herself. But she didn't even realise along the way. And for me, looking at that, I'm like, how do you not realise? So it's trying to, like, I guess, how can we get people to realise along the way of their journeys of, you know, going into eating disorders or not sleeping properly? How can we help people catch themselves before it becomes a problem, and then they have to seek help to fix these issues?
Well, again, it's going to depend upon the age of the individual.
Okay.
And for example, you might have children who have a particular problem, and this is where it's important for the caregiver, the parent, for example, the responsible adult, to be able to identify that, you know, those issues, you know, that the person is experiencing, and then take action. Okay, so this is where parents are very important and have a crucial role to play in that. Okay, and maybe we could have a bit of time talking about, you know, some of those issues.
Definitely.
At some point. But when it comes to adults, and let's say focus on people who might be anorectic or have an anorectic disorder, or even a bulimia, you know, where they're not eating or they're eating and then vomiting. Okay, and Princess Diana was identified allegedly as having a bulimic condition, that she would eat and go and vomit. You know, the late Princess Diana.
Yep.
And sometimes it's very important to realise that, you know, when we do start focusing on the physiological or the biological aspects, that that when you stop eating, or you're not eating much, you're losing weight, that also impacts on your the hormones that are released. But it also impacts on your perceptions of the world. So it's not uncommon for people, for example, that might be anorectic, to have distorted perceptions of their body, distorted perceptions about their self-esteem. Okay, it also impacts on your affect. It's not uncommon for people with that type of condition to think that they've eaten when in fact they haven't had anything, or that they've overeaten. Okay.
Yeah.
And
sorry, I have a lot of
complex,
clients that have like that issue there.
Yeah.
A lot of my clients will say, I start eating a meal and it's like I'm looking at a third person basically eating that meal, but it's me. It's like they remove themselves from, it's an out-of-body experience eating meals, and they just keep going and going and going.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so it's those perceptions count for a lot. And it's no different to an ordinary person who has a particular worldview. Okay, and so in other words, it's externalized rather than focusing on one's body, one's own body. And you know, the world's a lovely place. You know, life's a gift, for example. Or you might have the view that it's such a horrible world. It's attacking, when in fact it may not be. But again, it's these perceptions, you know, that people have. And as we know, that it's these perceptions that influence how we behave, how we interact with others, okay? And the worldviews might emanate from one's own family, you know, family of origin, and how one's parents viewed things, how you were treated as a child at home, at school, with your peers. And I also think that unfortunately now we've got the other aspect of social media and how that affects young people in particular, but I guess it can also and does affect older people.
Yeah. And and that's sort of where I wanted to go with that as well.
Yeah.
Like the perception of the world is hard now more than ever. And I guess, again, you're probably the best person to talk to about this because you have the knowledge of pre-social media, during social media, and then today's world. Three different worlds.
Yeah, and life, I think, was much easier in some respects. Okay, and I think young people do need to contend with many more aspects but it's not that older people, you know, didn't then. But then again, older people do need to contend with it these times. You know, in this day and age, so to speak.
Yeah. And so, I guess my generation, we were on the edge of, you know, I probably had 10 years, maybe 15 years before social media. Yeah. So I've learnt how to use it. You got the kids coming through now that are born into it, and then the generation above me didn't have it for a long time and trying to understand it. Yeah. So when it comes to like resilience in children, it's obviously going to be different to how their parents experienced resilience when they were growing up. Yeah. First, we probably should define resilience. So when I say the word resilience, how do we define that?
Yeah, well, I view resilience, you know, from a particular perspective, okay? And when it comes to definitions, there are many, many definitions of resilience. And when you review the literature on resilience, what one finds is that this construct or concept originated from engineering.
Okay.
Believe it or not.
Yeah.
Where this is one view, and that you're talking about materials being resilient. So in other words, not breaking, being malleable, being able to stretch, for example, the wire. Okay? So in other words, you've got buildings that are resilient. There are definitions that focus on communities. Resilient Victoria, resilient villages, resilient communities that have been affected by flood, fire. So we can look at resilience from a macro perspective. But there's also the micro perspective, the individual. What makes individuals resilient? And what is resilience when you talk about individuals? But also, what are firms, a firm and what might make a firm resilient to the turbulence, the uncertainty that we're facing at the moment. Okay? And so getting back to how I view it, and this is really based on the work of a number of PhD students that I've had that have looked at this area. And the perspective, and it's one of many that I take, is that resilience isn't a single construct. And I think people tend to view it as something as a single construct. It gets back to what I'm repeating over and over again. It's a multi-determined construct. And I regard resilience as a dynamic capability, a capacity. And it involves a number of capacities, a number of capabilities. And can we focus on the individual, for example? And so this might be the capability to bounce back to a previous level. It might mean the capability or the capacity, the asset, the skill to adapt. So resilience involves the ability to change, to be flexible, to be adaptable, to actually be able to scan your environment. It also means being able to identify the consequences, identify the opportunities, okay? But also to identify the risks associated with taking particular actions. And it's being able to put all of these capabilities together in a dynamic way that enables a person, I think, to be resilient. So it is insufficient to just focus on the unitary or the single component. So you are assisting a person in therapy or a person in the gym where you might work to develop some of these skills, some of these assets that they can apply to their day-to-day life. Excuse me.
No.
Yeah.
I absolutely love that. Go for it. And what you described makes perfect sense. And hearing it, I've had so many light bulbs go off. Like, we're taught, again, it's probably social media is probably the biggest issue. We're told resilience is like almost the opposite to what you said. Be a brick wall, be unbreakable, don't move, like don't give anything, and like whatever bangs up against you, you've just got to repel it, and that is resistance. That's almost the vibe of the word within the social media realm.
Yeah.
So what you've explained is just absolutely beautiful. It makes perfect sense, and why wouldn't that be more resilient?
Yeah, and let's take a biological or an ecological perspective. Okay, and again, you're drawing on these different perspectives or theoretical aspects, and we talk about Darwinianism, okay, and his theory of evolution, and how he developed the evolutionary perspective from visiting a number of different countries, including Australia and the Galapagos Islands, and how similar species developed depending on their environment. They developed in a particular way based on what was available to them ecologically, the environment that they were living in, there was this adaptability, this ability to be flexible. But that also influenced their genes. And so they developed a particular morphology, appearance. And so what I'm getting at is that there is this beautiful dance, this interaction between environments, what you're exposed to, and your genes. And this, I guess, competition between famous biologists like Mendel and Lamarckianism. So what affects what? You know, I'm been working with a highly intelligent PhD student who's looking at this issue of narcissism and what might be the genetic or biological determinants of that. And she's been able to identify a cluster of genes associated with it. But what I've learnt from Gab Miles, you know, there are two other supervisors working with her, and Andrew Francis and Merv from La Trobe University, and how genes are switched on and switched off. And getting back to the Galapagos Islands, that your environment switches your genes on or off depending on what's happening. And are those switched on or switched off genes transferred to a child, to a fetus, depending on what's happened in that parent's life, the father's and the mother's life? And there's research to show that they can be. And these genes might switch on the production or secretion of particular proteins that are essential for a particular expression of personality. And so on. So you've really got to look at the internal aspects as well as the external. Okay. And so it's a very complicated picture, and I'm only aware of it, but I don't have the expertise to say much more. Yeah. And
yeah, that's crazy.
it is.
So the life you live would, both physically, mentally, and how you perceive the world, would almost determine how your offspring would do the same? Is that sort of what that study's saying?
Well, it could.
Yeah.
And you can see it in, children's behaviour. And you ask yourself, how come my young daughter or my young son is replicating, to a certain extent, some of my behaviours at that age, at that similar age, or even later on? And as an adult, there are times when I look in a mirror and I say to myself, oh shit, you look just like your mum. I know I don't, but you kind of have that perception, and your behaviours can be very similar, and you can see that expression. And is that biologically determined, genetically, or is it because, the long association that you have with a parent, okay, that you see that expression? And or is it a bit of both? And I'm sure it is a bit of both. That the genetic component might explain, a high proportion of the variance in one's behaviour. It could be as high as 40%. And the rest is through learnt behaviour. And this is where learning is important too. And, you know, we haven't touched upon that. And
I did want to touch on that, but
did you?
let's go back to resilience.
Yes.
You said, at what age were you working in that first clinic set up for
children with disabilities,
Yep.
or even the mental health clinic?
Yep. So when was that?
Well, it was 1978 when I started there. So I was 24.
So
24. And boy, was it scary stuff.
in what regards?
Well, just, you know, I was wet behind the ears, still had a runny nose. You know, think of a 24-year-old, and you have people coming off the street, and they might be floridly psychotic, and having to deal with that. And I can still remember, you know, the first person that I saw when working at that clinic. It was actually a couple. And I don't want to go into the details because it's a bit embarrassing. And I don't want to disclose too much personally either. But yeah, and but it was very rewarding, and there was a way of learning. So this is where learning comes from, doing the reading, and also this opportunity to put into practice, you know, what you've learned. And because this clinic was set up as a way of helping to keep costs down. So in other words, you're not paying specialists, you know, but you're paying, you know, we used to be referred to as paramedics. You know, you're para to what? You are a specialist in your own field, but you're seen as an adjunct to psychiatrists. But you're at that front line, and you would consult with, you know, senior people, which is just a great learning experience in itself. And I had a similar experience when working in a child guidance clinic, where you're working with these experienced psychiatrists, and you're, you know, discussing with them your assessment of a particular, of a family, of a child, for instance, and putting that all together and formulating something in a dynamic way prior to actually commencing your treatment of the individual. And the other great thing about this community mental health centre is we started doing family therapy. And it was a new approach in Victoria.
Okay.
And there were fabulous psychologists and psychiatrists who worked in that area. People like Moshe Lang. I hope he's still working. And there's another great psychiatrist who's unfortunately not with us, and but I can't recall his name. But they introduced it, and they used us as, you know, the Melville. It was called the Melville Clinic in those days, as almost like guinea pigs, where they were training us in this new approach. So it was this movement away from the one-on-one approach, which is the psychodynamic, the psychoanalytic approach, and also one-on-one counselling, to actually working with the system. Can you imagine where you're viewing the individual in an ecological way? So how is this individual functioning in his or her family or partnership, for instance? And how is this interaction, this systemic interaction, influencing, helping to perpetuate the problems this person might be presenting with, and the extent to which it might have precipitated, you know, that psychotic episode, that depression, that sense of anxiety and so on. So it was a relatively new way of working, and it came out of cybernetics, the forerunner to computing. Can you see that? So in other words, you're looking at the ways in which, people like Bertalanffy, his name was, and so you're applying the principles, the systems thinking from science, technology, to your work with families.
Wow.
And it's also, and so in other words, you might have a person presenting with a particular problem, and but that problem really is secondary to what's happening in the family. So you won't resolve that problem unless the root causes are dealt with. And in family therapy, and again I'm digressing, there are many different types of approaches to family therapy. Approaches that might focus on the structure, the hierarchies in the family. And as an example, you might have a parent and child who act as a coalition against another parent. Okay? Or you might have parents who have got marital difficulties, but the child is presenting with the problem. Why? Because the child might act as a barometer, a thermometer to what's happening systemically within the family, between the parents. The child may not want to go to school because he or she is fearful that the parents might separate. So the problem is deflected or is taken up by a child. And they're just examples. And another approach to family therapy might focus on the strategic aspects. So in other words, you're dealing strategically with a target problem. Okay? Or you've got other approaches that have come from Europe, and you've got the, in my time when I was doing it, there was the Palazzoli group, where dealing with people with very, very severe problems. People diagnosed with schizophrenia, manic depression, or bipolar disorders. Okay? And they were focusing on the paradoxes, the counter-paradoxes, the ways in which family members communicated with each other, and so on. So, there's a lot to it.
Yeah.
It's exciting.
Definitely. It's just so interesting. You can go down so many different avenues.
Sorry, I'm going down lots of rabbit holes.
I love it. I love it. Is this a good point to bring up the study you sent through to me?
Well, we could, yeah.
Do you want to just explain to everybody what that study was and how it came about to start with?
Well, the study was about working with children and their parents. It's just one approach in a focused way, okay, but also in a time-limited way. And there was a time when I was working in what was called an inpatient unit. There are inpatient units in private hospitals and maybe to a certain extent in public hospitals. I'm not up to date with that. But I had a thing about working with people in a long-term way with them in the hospital. So in other words, at this hospital where I worked, there was a couple of young people who had been in that hospital for 2 years. And for me, that just didn't gel. Right.
Why were they in there?
They had severe problems. I think one had anorexia, was diagnosed as having anorexia, and the other one had, a psychosis, okay? But to have someone admitted into a hospital for such a long time, I think places a burden not only on the child, the parents, the family, other siblings, if they're part of that family, as well as the system, you know. And for me, I was of the opinion at that time, and to a large extent now, that the responsibility of care is not with the hospital, but with the family member, particularly of family members, okay? And you also don't want to take people out of families for very long periods of time, because what it does, it might encourage some dependency, it might encourage some detachment, but that's not to say that sometimes that's very important, because a young person might be exposed to risk. But then again, it's better that a person is in a family, be it a foster home, their own family of origin, or to have some other significant person caring for them, like a grandparent or a relative, and so on. And that needs to be assessed very, very carefully. But to have them in an institution for extended period of time, I think is potentially problematic. Because I think it can lead to institutionalization, because in families, while there is some predictability, in institutions there are routines that are rigidly held to. You have your meal at 5:30, 6 o'clock, you have the nurse that comes and does this, you have your doctor that comes at this particular point in time, you have these activities, and everything is in-house, including your education. So you want to have variability, and that helps to build resilience, because again, getting back to the ecological aspects, you want to have diversity. Why do you want to have diversity? Because it can lead to change. It leads to competition, and competition can be very healthy. Okay, it can be problematic too, but usually it's very healthy, and it can be motivating too. What motivates a tennis player, for example, to be better at what she's doing is to compete with the best in the world. Okay? So it can be a goal for you.
So how do you introduce those diversities?
So this is how I got onto the development of a time-limited brief therapy where you're working with people. So getting back to answering your question, but
yeah, and you said in the study that there was a certain point where just more wasn't effective.
It isn't, and this is where I was very interested to see whether if you could be focused, targeted in a planned way, working with, say, a child and his or her parents can be just as effective as an undifferentiated, unlimited form of therapy. And that was the kind of norm in the past, whereas things have moved along quite considerably back then to where things are at now, where if someone is visiting a psychologist for his or her problems, it is within a period of 12 sessions. But that's not and the majority of people have these 12 sessions, and sometimes they may have more, within a defined period of time. And so you really need to see whether you can work with people within that period. And I've adopted the approach that therapy, like other, psychotherapies or psychological treatments, ought to be, rather than a one-off thing, that you can view therapy as being something that you undertake throughout your life cycle, depending on what's happening in your life. So you don't have to give people tremendous insight into things, into their world, their inner world, over a very, very long period, but you can give them glimpses. And you want to be able to empower people to be able to go out and deal with these problems independently, using some of the techniques, some of the insight that they've gained from working with you. And they go out and they go back out into the land of the living, not into the land of the institution. That's where you see change. And you might do that throughout your life cycle. You might do it once, twice, 3, or on a number of occasions, but that's okay. You're dealing with your issues and you're living independently. And this is what you aim to do with, say, young people. You don't want to see them forever and a day. And people may have heard of Woody Allen, who said that he had been in psychoanalysis for, I forget the exact expression that he used, for 30 years. Come on. I'm sure he was exaggerating, but yeah. And psychoanalysis has its role to play. And it's very, very important for some people, but not for everyone. And cognitive behavioural therapy also has its role for some people. Insight-oriented psychotherapies, psychodynamic, psychoanalytic therapies also have their part to play in life, in the life of the individual.
Where you sent through some drawings you wanted to talk about. How do they fit into this? Because you sent through these drawings and they're drawings of a young person that I saw many, many years ago. And these were drawings of a young person, I think he was 6.5 years of age at that time, who'd been adopted. Okay? Yep.
And he was a very sad person. He had problems in his home and also at school. And he was also bedwetting. Okay? And one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about these drawings is that when you're working with young people, what you're doing is, to some extent, giving them an understanding into what's happening into their inner world. Okay, so and one way of doing that is through play. With young people, they express their emotions, their conflicts, their challenges through their play. Okay, and this is where it's important for a therapist to help that young person understand what's happening and to give meaning to their inner world and also to their behaviour. And one way of doing that is through drawings, because young people love to draw. Not everyone. And you can even say, so do older people. And Carl Jung used the sandpit as a way of helping people gain an understanding. So adults would play in a sandpit in any way, and they'd talk about what was happening. And this is what a technique that I would use with children. And for example, with this young person, as a psychotherapist, I gave him his own toy box when he came to play with me. And he had his own toys. No one else would play with these toys. And each time he would have his own toy box. But prior to then, to him playing in his own, with his own toys, there would be an in-depth assessment. And the approach that we used in those days, and I'm sure people do that now, is that someone would work with the parents and someone would work with the child, and maybe they would come together. But that approach is viewed by some psychologists as being very, very old-fashioned. And it was viewed not positively by family therapists. Why separate? See them all together. And to look at that systemic aspect. And that's just as good, just as effective. Okay? Others would say, you don't need to work with the parents. All you need to do is help the child. Okay? So, and you just give them techniques. Teach them techniques. You might have a psycho-educational approach to working with people. So these are just the array of approaches. Okay? But in this case, someone worked with the parents, I worked with the child. And I was interested in this time-limited therapy, and I saw this young person for 12 sessions. And as part of the assessment, I would ask this child to draw a good dream.
Okay. To
draw a bad dream. And this is a technique that was developed by Professor Bruce Tong, a child psychiatrist, a very prominent child psychiatrist who worked at the Austin.
So each session the child would draw a good and bad?
No, this is only at the assessment.
Oh, okay.
At the assessment. And this is a way of understanding what might be some of the conflicts that the child might have. And a technique that I developed was to ask the child to draw his or her family as animals.
Okay.
Not as they are, but as animals. As a way of gauging, depending on how they drew their family, and where they drew themselves in relation to the different family members. Okay? And to get them to talk about the dream, the family, as animals. You might also ask the child, as part of the assessment, to draw a tree as a way of gaining an understanding of how they viewed themselves, and to talk about this tree. Because we all have a self-esteem, sometimes high, sometimes medium, sometimes low. Okay, so you want to get an idea, and young people, whom you might see, tend to have a low self-esteem, and it's really helping them to feel this goodness about themselves. Okay, others, if we're talking about adults, they might feel rotten to the core. I'm a horrible person. I shouldn't be here. And it's understanding that and helping people understand how they regard themselves. Another technique as part of the assessment is asking them, who would you like to be with on a desert island? You might also ask a child, if a fairy came to visit you, what 3 wishes would you like to have? What would you tell this fairy? Okay, so you get an understanding of what their wishful thinking might be, what their needs might be. So you're using this gamut of approaches as a way of understanding that young person. And there's nothing preventing a therapist from using techniques, amongst others, with adults too, that they can. And then once you've done that, you start your therapy and you're explaining to the young person, I'm going to be seeing you for X number of sessions. And you might draw a box calendar and 12 boxes, and each time you come to see me, we're going to tick off one of these boxes so that you know how many sessions you are. And whether it's a child, an adolescent or teenager or adult, you want to be able to establish a rapport, a therapeutic relationship. And the change happens not only within the therapeutic relationship, but outside, through the meaning, the insight that they develop, and that understanding of what's happening. And with the drawings that I sent you, the first drawing was of a house, and also the second drawing was of a house burning down. And you get the child to talk about it. And he's talked about a young child, of a baby in a cot, and who was being rescued by firemen. Okay? And so it's, what is the meaning of that drawing, or that series of drawing in that session? And then the house in the third drawing was burnt to the ground. Okay? And so is that drawing of that, some people might say, look, I'm just extrapolating far too much, when you might say that, is the fireman the therapist? Is the baby in the cot the child, okay, who needs to be rescued? Yeah. And then, the other drawing that I sent, if I'm...
the boat?
Was the boat, yeah. And this is where, this is a boat with a rudder and also with a motor attached to it. And he talked about, and he also drew blue sky and a sun. And the person
smiling in the boat.
And a person smiling in the boat. And so this progression from, a very early session to one of the later ones, was, my understanding, was that he was saying something about him, that he was in a boat. He said that the person was feeling sad, but the sky, the sun, was happy. And but he also said something about the motor. He made sure that the motor, the propeller, wasn't too close to the rudder. So in other words, this sense of control. The rudder is a way of controlling. Okay? And he also talked about he talked about many other things, but we don't need to. And so that's a glimpse into what might happen in a therapy session, with a young person too. But it's also essential that someone is working with the parents, and that you're, again, aiming to build resilience, helping a child to build that resilience, more importantly, within themselves, that the parents are getting feedback as to what's happening in the session. And so when it comes to the termination, the end of the therapy, you're providing feedback, and you're giving them insight as to what has been touched upon. Obviously, there's elements of confidentiality and how you do that, because you respect the child. You've also got to respect the parents, yeah, and but you're wanting to empower them so that they can go away and work on the issues together, and that's where the benefits lie. It's
So is there any trending topics or I guess information that you give in the feedback that keep popping up time and time again that would be beneficial for people listening? So when you say you've gone through a therapy and then you give the feedback to the family, the kids, all that sort of stuff, is there any certain, I don't know, things that people would take away from that would keep coming up over and over again?
I think there are, because I remember I mentioned the name the Palazzoli group, and members of that Italian group, they were in Milan, and such an internationally renowned group of family therapists, and I think it was Luigi Boscolo who came with one other member, and he talked about, and I hope I'm addressing your question correctly, talked about like movies. So we're talking about the 1980s, and so I'm just trying to recall something from that period, 45 years ago, and or 40 years ago, say. And he talked about, in movies, ask yourself, how many themes are there to movies? There might be a theme relating to relationships, okay? A theme relating to war, a theme relating to crime, and so on. And I think at the time he said that there are only 9 themes, 9 movie themes, but there are plays on each of those themes. It makes you think, is that the case with psychological aspects? How many themes are there? And talking about trends, we do see trends in terms of diagnoses. We've seen trends in terms of autism, trends in terms of Asperger's syndrome. We've seen trends in terms of bipolar disorders.
Within kids?
No, not, within kids, and I'm not too sure about bipolar, but it's not to say that teenagers can't have that. We've also seen trends in terms of ADHD. Yeah. Trends in terms of, I've got Tourette's syndrome. Trends in terms of dyslexia. And these trends might be associated with what's happening in the social media. Okay? They might have something to do with identity. You know, my friend's got such and such a condition. I think I have too. I want to be identified within this tribe. So we've got this element of tribalism. But in young people, teenagers, identity is so important. There was a theorist by the name of Erik Erikson who talked about, the 8 stages of so-called personhood, manhood, man in the general sense, and I don't want to sound sexist. And in teenage years, adolescence, you're looking to this, challenge of developing your identity. What is my identity? And the conflict is one of identity versus identity diffusion. having a diffuse identity, but I want to have a clear-cut identity. This is who I am. I am someone who has this condition. That can happen.
And I find that's happening a lot because of, like you said, of social media, and we are people that, rely on others as well. Like you said, you see all your friends are getting diagnosed with these things on social media, especially TikTok. You see reels saying, if you have this, this and this, you have Asperger's. And self-diagnosis is getting higher and higher and all that sort of stuff.
And I forgot to mention that the diagnostic criteria have changed from the 80s. Okay? There were relatively fewer people in the 80s diagnosed with autism or even with Asperger's syndrome. And there were clear-cut criteria, whereas now the criteria have changed. Okay?
In what way?
Well, I guess they're much broader than what they are.
Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
I don't know if it's good or bad, but it's neither. It's neither. But it's providing people with, I guess, some people with insight into why they might be behaving in a particular way. It might be providing individuals with access to resources, treatments that they wouldn't have had without that diagnosis. It might even help people feel grounded. This aha moment. That's why I'm behaving this particular way. Okay? But it could have quite the opposite effects. Oh, shit. I've got this condition, that's just pathetic. So you might take a negative approach, whereas for others it could be much more positive. And hopefully it might motivate people. And it gets onto this other topic that we broached upon earlier.
And you touched on identity there. I can't imagine what it would be like a teenager now going through social media trying to find your identity. There's so much noise. There's so many people saying stuff and telling you different things. Is there any, ways that journaling, meditation, play, all that sort of stuff, anything that you'd recommend teenagers do now to quieten that noise and just help them find who they are?
Well, I really like your use of the word noise. There is a lot of noise, and that noise tends to be negative to a large extent, or it's perceived as being negative. And but what's important for teenagers is their peer group. Okay, it's peers. Parents start to become less important. And so you really, in my time, we spent a lot of time with peers. We spent a lot of time in groups. There was a lot of team sport. And so you want to encourage people to be in the land of the living, not in the land of the virtual. Because the land of the virtual is distorted. It's only a snapshot. And snapshots are transitory and not very helpful, I don't think. So if it's parents can encourage, their young people to go out and do their things, and to do things away from their family. We used to have, scouts, Girl Guides, playing football, having that sense of teamwork, camaraderie. And this is where the peer group becomes very important. And and it helps people to develop their own values. And the other aspect is when young people, teenagers, are arguing with their parents and wanting to do certain things, it's very easy to view that in a negative way. You know, my daughter is so much more rebellious, okay? But there's a positive aspect to that, because what that teenager is doing is inviting you as a mum or a dad or as a parents to express your values, what you're prepared to express, what forms part of your value system. And it's also providing the child, the teenager, to express her values. And sometimes never the twain do they meet, but other times there might be compromise. So this is from where my parents are coming. And so you've got to give people that opportunity to express it. And if you can view it in different ways, can be helpful too. And you see that with young people. Okay, they have their ways of doing things. You might be brought up in such a way that it's contrary to that. But can you live with it? And you're going to find that in schools, workplaces, in day-to-day lives, and so on.
I feel like sometimes, again, as society, we force people into certain, not we, but I guess, I don't know where it comes from. Bradley and I talk about this all the time, how people are just following along just because it's normal. And then when people push back, it's almost like they're trying to get pulled back into that normal line of thinking or whatever it is. So it's very interesting. I just wanted to dive into two more topics. I know we've got to wrap this up soon.
Yeah.
Just, I guess, your opinion on two different topics. I've had a guest on from South Sudan, and in their language, they don't actually have a word for depression. And I just thought that, again, like I grew up, depression was always a word.
Yes.
It's always a thing. And here's a culture where depression, they don't even have a word for it. I'm sure they had depression, but they don't have a word for it. So how does language and the words we use, I feel like sometimes it can define, the emotions and all that sort of stuff we're talking about. Going back to the guy or girl trying to surf, if you didn't have a word for fear, would you fear that thing? And would you still do it?
My immediate response to that is that people from South Sudan or people from Greece, North America or Australia or wherever, we are all humans. We all have a genetic constitution, okay? And conflicts, emotions are universal, okay? So I might have a conflict concerning fear. I might have conflicts regarding unhappiness, but it doesn't mean that I'm not expressing it. They might express it differently, but they identify it differently, okay? And so you're looking at a spectrum of identification, okay? And with, say, from a Western perspective, are you identifying the key feature of depression, which might be sadness? So therefore, if you're sad or if you're feeling, you might call it, I'm feeling down in the dumps. Or you might say, fuck, I just feel shithouse, absolutely shithouse. And that is a different way of expressing depression. Or I've got low self-esteem. It's still part of that range, part of that gamut. Okay? So it doesn't matter how you call it, you're still depressed. You still have that feeling. And so on. I hope I've made sense.
Another thing on that,
Yeah.
a lot of the time, again, I guess social media maybe, that it's almost looked, if you are depressed, it's a bad thing. Is it like, should you be labelling good and bad? Should emotion be good or bad, or is it just the emotion?
I think it is the emotion, and it can be a trap to dichotomize the world, and it's a very easy way of dichotomizing. And some specialists might say, or non-specialists might say, that labelling can be negative too. Okay, so it's I'd like to think of it as being part of a continuum. Okay, and there are levels of depression. On the one hand, you might have people that are psychotically depressed, or you might have what Sigmund Freud, getting back to him, talked about. One of the goals of psychoanalysis is to bring a person to a level where they have this common everyday unhappiness. You don't want to be happy all the time, because we know that happiness is momentary, and it's got to do with that injection of endorphin or whatever. Okay? You just want them to have that ordinary unhappiness. So, I'd like to talk about feeling content, feeling okay. That I guess that program of I'm okay, you're okay, is just really good. And so, in other words, you just want to be all right so that you can function and enjoy things and to perform the way that you want. Sometimes you might feel exhilarated. Great. But as we know, those feelings subside. No different to, let's get into sex. You reach a climax. You have an orgasm. Okay? But does that last forever? No. For a bloke, bang, that high, wow. It just blew my mind out, and it starts to subside. I'm not too sure about women. Everyone's different. But that's how it is. And then you want to be able to function ordinarily. And so, that's a sort of way of looking at it.
What's the difference between motivation and discipline?
Well, one might be a part of another, but I guess with discipline has to do with, being able to do, you're doing things, okay? But you're doing things in a particular way, it might be a structured way. And I guess, the discipline, has to do, with some of your personality characteristics. There might be the guardrails, you're disciplined in a way. You're being social, you've socialized yourself, for example, whereas motivation is, could be regarded as being goal-oriented. You're motivated to do something. You're motivated to act. You're motivated to think in a particular way. So there might be an affectual component to the thinking, and that's all part of motivation.
Would you try and get somebody motivated and then build the discipline in there to keep them in that lane? Would that be?
Not necessarily, and there's something about doing things concurrently. It doesn't have to be one is a precursor to the other. And you might do something that's tangential to both discipline and motivation. And so you might be getting people to do something that's totally unrelated. For example, can you pass me that glass, or pass me that microphone, that we're talking into? And that's a way, that might be a precursor to the person doing something that you want them to be motivated to do, like to lift an extra kilogram of weight, in the gym, motivating them. Okay, so well, it's sort of triggered some other thoughts, but that'll put us on another tangent. But yeah, okay.
What other thoughts?
Yeah, sorry.
What other thoughts?
Well, the thought was, when I was at Melville Clinic back in the 70s, I was working with a young person who was floridly psychotic. And it was just so hard. And, this is a young person who had, his vocab was neologisms. He would invent words. Uga chaga, uga, back then, or kito, kato, and it was a mixture of English and Greek words, okay? And I would go to his home, pick him up, and one time, I was driving him back to the clinic because the parents were unable to drive him to the clinic, and we stopped at the lights, and he jumped out of the car and ran off, and fuck. I was just out of my mind because, could have been hit by a car and running on the road. So that's the sort of thing. And he didn't have this sense of control, and his drawings were just extraordinary. But there was, and I invited this person who was a teacher, but also he had other skills to help me work with this young person. And it was just amazing the sort of techniques that he used to deal with. The young boy's name was Tommy, and to work with Tommy. And I just kind of thought, wow, this is just amazing that you can work with people and get them to come back into reality. And but then that was all lost. And this is where some people do need to be have medication. And I worked with adults who had it, and they're on drugs that suppressed the symptoms, such as hallucinations, whether they're auditory or verbal hallucinations, or even the visual hallucinations where they're looking up, or the paranoia where they think that the TV is giving them messages, or the mobile phone, or it's not uncommon to see it on the streets now. Whereas I was looking at my phone about a month ago, and I was on the tram, and this person got angry with me because they thought I was taking photos of them. Okay? When in fact all I was doing was looking at my football team. Okay? So, sometimes you need to, I've kind of lost what we're talking about, but, the sort of, sometimes you've got to do things in an indirect way of dealing with things. Yeah.
So the last...
Sorry, I'm kind of all over the place like a dog's breakfast.
It's good. I think that's like the way I ask the question, then how you're thinking about answering is just like it's new to me. So it's I love how you're answering it, because you're making me think of ways to think about things that I didn't even think of. Like the direction of thought is new to me. So it's good.
Yeah.
And I've always said, like, asking better questions is, the best thing you can do.
Yeah.
And thinking how to ask better questions. And you're definitely teaching me how to sort of think about different things to then ask better questions.
Yeah. And I think from where I come is that it's an advantage if you can draw in from different disciplines as much as possible. And because they all have something to contribute, be it small or in a greater way. Okay.
And being open to different things. Like,
yeah.
by the sounds of it, you've just had so many different avenues of experiences and thoughts, especially in your early, mid-20s, when you were just shoved in. I reckon you would have honed your skills a lot very fast.
From going from occupational therapy to working as a psychotherapist to doing psychology to doing a PhD. I spent 3 years working with research on dementia. It's so rewarding because my mother tragically developed Alzheimer's, and that taught me a lot as well. And then going from there, from health, into an accounting and finance department. And that was a quantum leap. But it gets back, and then going from there to teaching statistics. I used to hate statistics, but it's using psychological techniques to help me master that. I would go surfing, and then I'd read statistics books. So it's pairing something I hated and loathed with something I love, surfing, and doing that while camping. And so this is a behavioural technique. And then I started teaching it, and to be able to teach that easily. But it's also having good mentors. That's important to have. So there are, so again, the key word for today is multi-determined.
Definitely.
Okay, that's what I think. But it's being able to adapt, be flexible. And another thing that I learned was being able to swallow your anxiety.
What do you mean by that?
Well, we all get anxious for one reason or another. Rather than expressing it, swallow it. Hold it in and let it pass. Rather than expressing it by running away, or fighting, the fight-flight type thing, that sometimes it can be best just to swallow it and then try to understand what it is that's making me feel anxious, tense at this point in time. So you're not responding impulsively. And it's...
I've got a guest coming up that's written a book on pausing. The book's called Pausing.
Yeah, excellent.
But the author does it around food. So before you go and eat something, you just pause and think, why am I eating this? And most of the time you're going to stop and not eat it because, it's probably not good for you. But I've been trying to do that in life as well.
Yeah.
Like a lot of the business things I'm doing, because like I was saying before, a lot of the time we're just doing things because, it's what you should be doing. You go to work, you work a certain amount of hours, doesn't matter what you're getting done, but you're just working because that's what you do at work. So I've been stopping and pausing before I send an email, before I do this, I guess
that's such an excellent idea of pausing, because what did we used to do when we were predominantly religious? Yeah, we would say a prayer before, or grace, before we ate. We paused. Okay? Very few people do that now. When young people go out to dinner, when you go out with your boyfriends, your girlfriends, pause the phone. Pause it. Give food priority. Give bedtime priority. Pause things. Pause it for that. What am I doing now? I'm pausing going into the office to speak with Jack Graham. So yeah, great. I think this guy's idea's spot on. Yeah.
The last question was spoiled.
Yeah.
I'm actually looking forward to the answer. So if you had control over every single person, they had to do one thing every day, and that one thing comes from you, and you give it to the population, everybody has to do it. What's that one thing?
The one thing that I would do, and what comes to mind, is first of all, respect yourself.
And how would you get people to do that?
Hang on, and that could spill over to respecting others.
100% agree.
And if you can't respect yourself, then it's going to be difficult to respect others. And related to that is one of forgiving, self-forgiveness, self-respect, self-forgiving, and forgive others. I'm not religious. I'm actually an atheist. Okay? But I think they're important qualities that you'd like to see in others.
How do you get the population to forgive themselves and show more self-respect?
How? That's the... well, first of all, you need them to be aware, okay, that am I doing it? What situations am I doing it in? How often do I do it? What prevents me? What is the barrier for self-forgiveness? Okay? And to be able to identify what they are. What prevents me from respecting Jack for what he is? Okay? And I think these precursors will then lead to action, helping you to break down those barriers, okay, and to develop behaviours that are appropriate. Sometimes, I had a run-in with a neighbour, okay, and the other day I saw him having a drink outside of a pub. And I actually went up to him and spoke with him about something. And but this forgiveness came into the the interaction. And I talked with him about burying the hatchet. Okay, and I've done that one other time with a colleague when I worked at RMIT University, a very, very senior colleague that I had a run-in with. And and so this is the forgiveness, and it's a relief. We all carry around this backpack of history. Just chuck out an item. Yeah, and this is where the self-forgiveness and your world becomes lighter. And this is what you want.
I 100% agree. And like you said, you can't forgive others unless you're forgiving yourself. Do you recommend journaling, anything like that?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
And not only journaling, and this is a technique that I learnt from my wife, the clinical psychologist, Stephanie. And when she developed this technique when working with international students. And this is journaling in their own mother tongue or father tongue. Not so much in English. And so your thinking is different. For people who have a migrant background, when I talk in Greek, it's a bastardized Greek, it's lousy, shithouse, and so on. I speak in a very different tone. And when I talk with Greek people in this bastardized way, I'm much more, confident or whatever. But sometimes you lose that confidence too. So journalism in your mother tongue, and compare that, in your second or third or fourth language, can be different. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Is a lot of people haven't even written a word since they were at school. Any place you think people should start with? I don't know, starting the journal. Yeah.
Well, you can still journal on your mobile phone, notepad. Just download an app. Get an exercise book. Young people are being encouraged to write now rather than just typing everything. And just as journaling in your mother tongue is probably very similar to writing it down rather than typing it.
If I was to coach you for the next 30 days on your habits, your nutrition, your sleep, your fitness, do you think you'd feel like a new person? I see this all the time. People getting excited after watching a YouTube video, listening to a podcast, or downloading a PDF. They have all this good information, but then they fail. A, because they don't know how to implement that information, or B, they haven't got anybody holding them accountable to implement that information in their day-to-day life. And that is exactly why I created the 30-day reset. So we can work together every single day for the next 30 days. I'm going to show you how to build a rock-solid morning routine. Make a workout routine that fits into your life, that works for you instead of against you. How to eat for your goals without tracking calories. We're going to work on the fun stuff, stress management, sleep, and then we're going to build a strong mindset so these habits last well after the 30 days is done. I am obviously excited to help you in this next 30 days. So let's get started. Stop watching the YouTube videos, podcasts, all that sort of stuff, and let's just start making real change that lasts for the next 30 days and beyond. Okay, stop waiting. Let's get into it. Let's go.